You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple: subscribe. We're almost at 9,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's dive into today's story. What would you do if you stumbled upon a truth so ancient and terrifying it could unravel reality as we know it? I'm about to tell you something that cost me everything. My career, my peace of mind, and nearly my sanity. My name is Jacob Wright, and 4 years ago, I encountered something that the world isn't ready to know exists. But ready or not, it's coming for all of us. For 17 years, I worked for a division of the government that doesn't officially exist. We investigated phenomena that couldn't be explained through conventional means, things that threaten national security in ways the public never hears about. I wasn't some wide-eyed believer in the supernatural. I was the guy who found the rational explanation, the mundane truth hiding behind extraordinary claims. I was good at my job because I didn't believe in monsters. I'd investigated supposed haunted military installations and found faulty wiring. I tracked down alleged alien signals that turned out to be malfunctioning satellites. I debunked psychics, exposed frauds, and explained away every mystery I'd ever encountered with cold, hard facts. I should have kept it that way. I should have stayed in my comfortable world of rational explanations and provable theories. September 2019. I was called into a briefing room at 3 a.m. The call came through on my secure phone, the one that only rang when something serious was happening. I'd been asleep for maybe 2 hours after wrapping up a case in New Mexico. Some nonsense about unexplained lights in the desert that turned out to be drones from a private tech company. I was tired, irritable, and not in the mood for another wild goose chase. That attitude died the moment I walked into that briefing room and saw my handler's face. David Chen was a man I'd worked with for a decade. He was former CIA, had seen things that would break most people, and nothing rattled him. Nothing. But that morning, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hands trembled slightly as he passed me the file folder. Dark circles hung under his eyes, and there was something in his expression I'd never seen before. Fear. A remote research station in northern Canada had gone completely silent. 9 scientists stationed above the Arctic Circle, monitoring geological activity and atmospheric conditions. Their last transmission came through 84 hours prior, and it was disturbing. David played me the recording. Static at first, then voices. Multiple voices speaking over each other in languages our linguistics people couldn't identify. It wasn't gibberish. The phonemes were too structured, too deliberate. But it didn't match anything in our databases, and we had databases that covered everything from ancient Sumerian to isolated Amazonian tribal dialects. The voices rose and fell in what sounded almost like chanting, synchronized but discordant, creating harmonics that made my teeth ache just listening to the recording. Then, abruptly silence. Not the silence of a disconnected line, but the heavy silence of an open channel with no one speaking. You could hear breathing on the other end. Multiple people breathing in perfect unison. Then, the line went dead. That was 84 hours ago. Since then, nothing. No calls, no emails, no emergency signals. The station's automated system showed everything was operational. Power running, heat maintaining, equipment functioning perfectly. The weather monitoring stations were still collecting data. The seismic sensors were still transmitting readings. But no human contact. No response to any communication attempts. Satellite imagery showed lights on inside the facility, smoke from the heating system's chimney, even footprints in the snow around the exterior from within the last 24 hours. It looked occupied, but it was as if everyone inside had simply stopped being human. They were sending me in with a team of 3. Luke Peterson, our communications specialist, a guy who could hack into anything and had a mind like a steel trap. I'd worked with Luke on a dozen operations. He was brilliant, methodical, and had an uncanny ability to find digital breadcrumbs that others missed. Phil Davidson, security and tactical, former military, with more combat experience than he'd ever talk about. Phil was the guy you wanted beside you when things went sideways. He was calm under pressure, quick thinking, and had saved my life twice in situations that should have killed us both. And Bubba Torres, our field medic and survival expert, a man who'd kept teams alive in situations that should have killed them. Bubba had gotten his nickname in basic training, and despite looking like he should be teaching kindergarten, he was the toughest person I'd ever met. He'd survived 3 weeks in the Alaskan wilderness with nothing but a knife and a water bottle after a helicopter crash. If anyone could handle the Arctic, it was Bubba. The flight north was quiet. We took a military transport to a Canadian airbase, then switched to a smaller aircraft that could handle the extreme conditions. Luke spent the journey reviewing the station's technical specifications, his laptop screen casting a blue glow on his face as he made notes. Phil cleaned his weapons with methodical precision, breaking down his rifle and reassembling it 3 times, checking every component. It was a ritual he performed before every mission, and I found the repetition oddly comforting. Bubba stared out the window at the landscape growing increasingly hostile below us. The green gradually gave way to grey, then to white, an endless expanse of ice and snow that looked utterly alien. I read through the mission brief again, looking for something I'd missed, some detail that would make sense of this. The research station had been operational for 3 years. It was part of a larger network monitoring climate change effects in the Arctic. The team consisted of geologists, atmospheric scientists, and climate researchers. Nothing unusual about their work. Nothing that should have resulted in them going silent in such a disturbing way. The personnel files showed normal people, accomplished scientists with families and mortgages and pets waiting for them at home. Dr. Elizabeth Oakes, the team leader, had 2 teenage daughters and coached youth soccer in her spare time. Raymond Cole, one of the geologists, was engaged to be married in 6 months. These weren't people who would just vanish without explanation, but I'd learned over the years that normal people could do extraordinary things under the right circumstances. Isolation could break even the strongest minds. The Arctic darkness, the endless cold, the knowledge that you were thousands of miles from civilization, it could all add up to psychological breaks that manifested in strange ways. I'd seen it before. I was already forming theories. Mass psychosis, carbon monoxide poisoning affecting the entire team, some kind of biological contamination that caused neurological symptoms. There would be a rational explanation. There always was. We landed at a staging area 50 miles from the station. The helicopter couldn't get us closer due to weather conditions. A storm was rolling in from the north, and the pilot wanted to get back to base before it hit. We'd be on our own until the weather cleared, which could be anywhere from 2 days to 2 weeks. The rest would be by snowmobile, across terrain that wanted us dead. It was mid-September, but this far north, winter had already arrived with a vengeance. The sun barely made it above the horizon, creating a perpetual twilight that played tricks on your eyes. Shadows stretched for miles, and the line between land and sky blurred into a uniform grey. The journey took 6 hours. The temperature was 15 below zero, and that was before factoring in the wind chill. The wind cut through our cold weather gear, like we were wearing nothing, finding every gap, every seam, every exposed inch of skin. My face went numb within the first hour. By hour 3, I'd lost feeling in my feet despite the thermal boots. By hour 5, I was beginning to question my career choices. The landscape was utterly barren, devoid of life or variation, just endless white in every direction, broken occasionally by ice formations that looked like frozen waves. The sound of the snowmobile engines was deafening, but whenever we stopped to check our bearings, the silence that followed was worse. It was absolute, total silence. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just us and the ice and the dying light. By the time the station appeared in the distance, I'd lost feeling in my face. My hands felt like wooden blocks, and I was questioning whether we'd even find anything worth this misery. But as we approached, something felt wrong. Bubba was the first to speak, his voice muffled by his face mask. Generators are running. Someone's maintaining this place. He was right. The exterior lights were on, casting yellow pools of light onto the snow. Smoke rose from the heating system's chimney in a steady stream. The facility looked completely normal, warm and inviting, after hours in the brutal cold. We should have been seeing movement, faces in the windows, someone coming out to meet us and ask what took us so long. But there was nothing. No one came out to greet us. No faces appeared in the windows. The building just sat there, lit up and warm, and utterly silent. We approached cautiously, Phil taking point with his rifle ready. The station was built in a modular design, several connected structures that could be expanded as needed. The main building housed the living quarters and common areas. The attached modules contained the laboratories, equipment storage, and the power plant. Everything looked intact. No signs of damage, no broken windows, no indication of any kind of emergency. The snow around the entrance had been cleared recently, within the last day or so. Someone had been out here doing maintenance, going about their daily routine. But where were they now? We entered through the main airlock, standard decontamination protocol, though we didn't know what we were decontaminating from. The airlock cycled us through, and the inner door opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure. The interior was heated, almost uncomfortably warm after the brutal cold outside. The sudden temperature change made my exposed skin prickle and burn as feeling returned. I pulled off my face mask and gloves, flexing my fingers to restore circulation. The air smelled normal. No chemical odors, no smoke, no indication of any kind of contamination. Just the usual scent of a lived-in space. Coffee, cleaning products, the faint mustiness of recycled air. And it was pristine, clean, organized, like everyone had just stepped out for a moment and would be right back. The common area was just past the airlock, a large open space with tables, chairs, and a kitchenette. There were meals sitting out on the tables, sandwiches with a single bite taken out of them, bowls of soup, the contents congealed but recognizable, coffee in mugs, still faintly warm to the touch when Phil checked them. These were poured maybe 6 hours ago. Someone was here this morning. His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the unease underneath. This wasn't normal. This wasn't any kind of emergency he'd trained for. But there was no one. We split up, clearing the facility room by room. I went with Phil, Luke paired with Bubba. We moved through the corridors methodically, checking every space, every closet, every possible hiding place. Personal quarters showed signs of recent occupancy. Beds unmade, blankets thrown back as if people had just gotten up. Clothes laid out on chairs, ready to be put on. Books open on nightstands. Bookmarks placed carefully to save the page. In one room, a laptop was still on, screensaver cycling through family photos. In another, a half-written email sat on the screen, a message home to someone that would never be finished. The medical bay was fully stocked and perfectly organized. Medications in their proper places, equipment clean and ready for use. The kitchen had fresh food in the refrigerator, meal plans written on a whiteboard. Someone's birthday circled on the calendar for next week with a note to bake a cake. Everything suggested people living their daily lives, following their routines, making plans for the future. Except there were no people. It was like something had reached down and plucked them out of existence mid-activity, leaving everything else untouched. We regrouped in the main corridor. Luke's face was pale. This doesn't make sense. Where are they? 9 people don't just vanish. Bubba was checking his medical kit, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, but his eyes kept darting to the windows. Maybe they left. Emergency evacuation. Phil shook his head. Cold weather gear is all still here. They didn't go outside, not voluntarily. He was right. The equipment room near the airlock held 9 sets of Arctic survival gear, all hanging in their designated spots. No one could survive more than minutes in this environment without proper equipment. If they'd left the facility, they'd be dead within the hour. But there were no bodies, no blood, no signs of violence or struggle, just absence. Luke found the communication room. It was a small space packed with electronics, screens displaying satellite feeds and weather information, radio equipment for maintaining contact with the outside world. All the equipment was functioning perfectly, but it had been deliberately switched off. Every system, every transmitter, every link to the outside world had been manually disabled. Someone didn't want to talk to the outside world, Luke said, bringing the systems back online. His fingers flew across the keyboards, running diagnostics and checking logs. This wasn't a malfunction. This was a choice. Someone shut everything down 3 days ago at 11:47 in the evening. They knew what they were doing. They locked out the remote access protocols so no one could turn it back on from outside. We moved to the main research laboratory. It was the largest single space in the facility, filled with equipment I only partially understood. Seismic monitoring stations, atmospheric sensors, computers displaying scrolling columns of data. Experiments were still running, cultures growing in incubators, automated systems carrying out their programmed functions. The computers were logged in, screens showing ongoing monitoring programs that had been running for days without interruption. Phil examined the security system. The station had cameras covering every corridor, every entrance, every common space. The footage should have told us exactly what happened. But when Phil pulled up the security interface, his expression darkened. The footage has been manually deleted. Every file from the past 2 weeks, gone. Whoever did this knew where the backups were stored and erased those too. Not everything, Bubba said from across the room. He was standing at a desk in the corner, holding a leather-bound notebook, the kind researchers use for field notes. Personal journals weren't unusual in remote postings like this. People kept them to maintain their sanity, to record their thoughts and observations in something more permanent than digital files that could be lost to a hard drive failure. Found this in a desk drawer. Belongs to Dr. Elizabeth Oakes. I took the journal carefully, as if it might disintegrate. In my hands, the leather was worn, the binding cracked from use. The handwriting on the first page was neat, precise, scientific. Clear labels for dates and times, organized observations, the methodical notes of someone trained to document everything. But as I flipped through the pages, the handwriting changed. It grew larger, more erratic. Words were underlined multiple times. Sentences ran together without punctuation. By the last page it had deteriorated into something barely legible, frantic scrawls that slashed across the paper with enough force to rip through in places. I sat down at one of the lab benches and began to read. Dr. Oakes's first entries were routine, almost boring. Geological surveys measuring the stability of the permafrost, atmospheric readings tracking temperature fluctuations and air quality, daily life observations about the team dynamics, the food, the challenges of living in such an isolated environment. She wrote about missing her daughters, about video calls home that helped fight the loneliness, about the strange beauty of the Arctic landscape. It was the diary of a scientist doing her job, nothing more. Then, 4 weeks before the station went silent, something changed. They detected unusual tremors coming from deep beneath the permafrost. At first, Dr. Oakes noted them as curiosities, minor seismic events that didn't match the usual patterns, but they continued, growing more frequent and more regular. The seismic sensors picked them up at precisely the same time each day, lasting for exactly 17 minutes before stopping. The frequency was wrong, the pattern too consistent to be natural tectonic activity. It was coming from approximately 3 miles down, deeper than the permafrost layer, deeper than the bedrock itself, from a depth where nothing should be moving. She wrote, "This isn't tectonic. This is something else." The team is divided on what to make of it. Some think it's equipment malfunction, that our sensors are picking up interference from our own systems. But I've checked and rechecked. The readings are real. Something down there is active, and it's following a pattern. Raymond thinks it might be a previously unknown type of geological phenomenon. Thomas thinks we should report it to headquarters and let them decide how to proceed. But I'm curious. We didn't come all this way to ignore the first genuinely interesting thing we've found. They deployed deep penetration sonar equipment, sophisticated instruments designed to map underground structures through layers of ice and rock. The process took days, building up a three-dimensional image of what lay beneath them through countless individual soundings. What they found made them question everything they thought they knew about the region's geology. A massive cavity existed beneath the ice, perfectly preserved by the permafrost that had kept it isolated for millennia. But it wasn't a natural cave system. Natural caves form through water erosion or lava tubes, following the path of least resistance through rock, creating irregular organic shapes. This was different. The dimensions were too precise, too deliberate. The walls were too straight, the angles too sharp. It had geometry that suggested architecture, conscious design, purpose. The cavity was enormous, roughly circular, about 300 feet in diameter and 50 feet high. The sonar couldn't penetrate the walls themselves. They were made of something denser than the surrounding rock, something that shouldn't exist at that depth in this location. And at the center of the cavity, the sonar showed a large object, geometric and artificial, sitting in perfect isolation. The team debated for days. Natural formation, some kind of ancient human construction. The indigenous peoples of the Arctic had been there for thousands of years, but nothing in the archaeological record suggested they had the capability or reason to build something 3 miles beneath the surface. Could it be from a more recent expedition, a secret Cold War installation? But the rock layers above showed no signs of drilling or excavation. Whatever was down there had been sealed away for a very, very long time. Dr. Oakes made the decision to lower a remotely operated camera probe. They needed to see what was down there, to get visual confirmation of what the sonar was showing them. The probe was a sophisticated piece of equipment designed for deep ocean exploration, but adapted for their purposes. It had powerful lights, multiple cameras, and sensors to measure temperature, air composition, and radiation levels. They spent 2 days preparing, running checks and rechecks, making sure everything would function properly. Then, on a Wednesday morning, they began the descent. The probe was lowered through a natural fissure they'd located using ground-penetrating radar, a crack in the rock that went down at a steep angle. It was narrow, barely wide enough for the probe to fit through, but it provided access to the depths below. The descent took hours, the probe's cameras showing nothing but ice and rock, the walls of the fissure pressing in from all sides. The temperature readings gradually increased as they went deeper, which was normal. Geothermal heat meant that the deeper you went, the warmer it got, but the rate of increase was faster than it should have been. By the time they reached 2 miles down, the temperature had risen to just above freezing. warm enough for liquid water to exist. Then, suddenly, the probe entered open space. The cameras swung wildly as the probe dropped through the ceiling of the cavity, then stabilized on their gyroscopic mounts. The footage they retrieved showed something that shouldn't exist, something that made Dr. Oakes question her own sanity. An immense underground chamber, carved from living rock with a precision that seemed impossible for the era in which it must have been created. The walls weren't rough or irregular. They were smooth, almost polished, reflecting the probe's lights like dark mirrors. And they were covered in symbols. The symbols were everywhere, carved into every surface in neat, precise rows. They weren't hieroglyphics or cuneiform, or any writing system Dr. Oakes recognized, and she had a background in archaeology in addition to her geological expertise. They were angular and complex, each one unique, covering the walls from floor to ceiling in what appeared to be organized text. The precision of the carvings suggested metal tools, advanced technology, but the erosion patterns on the stone suggested impossible age. This chamber had been here long before humans developed writing, long before civilization itself. At the center of the chamber stood a massive stone construct. It was roughly rectangular, about 30 feet long and 15 feet wide, carved from a single piece of dark stone that didn't match the surrounding rock. It looked almost like a sarcophagus, but on a scale meant for something much larger than human. The surface was covered in more symbols, these ones deeper and more elaborate, layered over each other in complex patterns. And there were chains, massive chains, each link as thick as a man's torso, carved from the same dark stone, running from the corners of the construct to anchor points in the chamber walls. The chains were part of the original construction, not added later. Whatever was inside had been meant to stay inside. Dr. Oakes wrote, "We found something that predates recorded history. The implications are staggering. This isn't human construction, or if it is, it's from a civilization we have no record of. The sophistication of the carving, the scale of the engineering, the preservation over what must be thousands or tens of thousands of years. I don't know what to make of it." The team is excited, but also deeply unsettled. There's something about the footage that bothers us, though we can't articulate what. The chamber feels wrong somehow, even viewing it remotely through cameras. Like we're looking at something we shouldn't be seeing, something that was meant to stay hidden. But something else happened after they sent the probe down. Something that should have made them stop immediately, should have made them seal the fissure and leave this place and never come back. The team began experiencing sleep disturbances. It started the very night after they viewed the probe footage. Multiple members reported vivid nightmares, identical in content, down to specific details. They dreamed of celestial warfare, of a great battle in the heavens. They saw beings of terrible beauty, radiant with light, locked in combat. They saw beauty turning to horror as some of those beings fell, plummeting from great heights, their light dimming as they descended. They saw ancient conflicts that predated humanity, saw the world when it was young and empty, saw things that their waking minds insisted could not be real, and through every dream one name echoed, Azazel. The name was spoken by voices that shook the foundations of reality, called out in anguish and fury and desperate warning. Azazel. They would wake up with the name on their lips, the sound of it still reverberating in their minds. Some of the team members had religious backgrounds and recognized the name from apocryphal texts. Others had never heard it before but knew with absolute certainty that it was important, that it meant something terrible. The team psychiatrist, Dr. Lisa Chen, dismissed it as stress-induced mass suggestion. They were isolated, working in an extreme environment, facing the psychological pressure of an extraordinary discovery. It was natural for their minds to create narratives, to process the strangeness of what they'd found through familiar cultural frameworks of angels and demons, It was a shared delusion, nothing more. She recommended they take a break from work, engage in recreational activities, maintain healthy sleep schedules. She prescribed sleep aids for those who wanted them. But the dreams intensified. They became more vivid, more detailed, more real than reality itself. People began waking up screaming, thrashing in their beds, sometimes injuring themselves in their panic. Some refused to sleep at all, dosing themselves with caffeine and stimulants, terrified of what they would see if they closed their eyes. The common areas became occupied at all hours by team members trying to stay awake, their eyes red and haunted, their hands shaking from exhaustion and chemical stimulation. The station's atmosphere changed. People became irritable, paranoid. They argued over small things. They jumped at shadows. And always, the name Azazel hung over everything like a curse. I looked up from the journal, my own hands shaking slightly. The lab was silent. Luke, Phil and Bubba were watching me, waiting. "Luke," I said, my voice hoarse, "I need you to research something. The name Azazel. Find me everything you can." Luke nodded and moved to one of the computers, his fingers already typing before he'd fully sat down. While Luke worked, I continued reading, though part of me wanted to stop, wanted to close the journal and forget everything I'd seen. But I needed to know. I needed to understand what had happened here. Dr. Oakes had decided to physically explore the chamber. The journal entries became longer, more detailed, as she wrestled with the decision. Headquarters had sent a message advising caution, suggesting they wait for additional resources and specialized equipment. Some team members argued they should leave well enough alone, that they documented the chamber and that was sufficient. But Dr. Oakes couldn't let it go. The scientist in her needed to know more, needed to see it with her own eyes, needed to understand what they'd found. Despite warnings from headquarters, despite the growing unease among her team, despite the nightmares that were tearing them apart, scientific curiosity won. She assembled a descent team of 5 volunteers. Herself, because she couldn't ask anyone to do something she wasn't willing to do. Raymond Cole, the geologist who'd first insisted the tremors were significant. Dr. Thomas Westbrook, their archaeology specialist, who'd been studying the symbols in the probe footage. Sarah Kim, an engineer who would assess the structural stability. And Marcus Day, their climbing specialist and safety officer. The descent would be dangerous. The fissure was narrow and unstable. They'd need to widen parts of it with drilling equipment, which risked causing collapses. But they'd taken safety precautions, established protocols, prepared for every contingency they could imagine. The descent took 8 hours. They had to move slowly, carefully testing each anchor point before trusting their weight to it. The fissure twisted and turned, sometimes opening into larger spaces, sometimes narrowing until they had to squeeze through gaps that seemed impossibly tight. The rock around them groaned and shifted, compressed by the enormous weight of the earth above. They descended in darkness, their headlamps creating small pools of light that made the shadows beyond seem even deeper. The temperature rose steadily as they went down, and by the time they reached 2 miles, they'd stripped off their heavy outer layers, despite the logical impossibility of warmth at this depth. When they reached the chamber, the first thing they noticed was the temperature. It was warm, genuinely warm, like a comfortable room heated to about 70 degrees. Impossible given the depth and the Arctic location above. There was no heat source visible, no volcanic activity, no explanation for why this space should be anything other than freezing cold. But it was warm, and the air was fresh, breathable, with normal oxygen levels. It was as if the chamber existed outside normal physical laws, as if it was somehow separate from the rest of the world. The stone construct dominated the space, even more imposing in person than it had been in the probe footage. Up close, they could see details the cameras had missed. The symbols weren't just carved into the surface, they were inlaid with something else, a dark material that caught the light strangely, that seemed to shift and move when you weren't looking directly at it. The chains weren't simple restraints. They were covered in smaller symbols, thousands of them, each link inscribed with text that spiraled around the metal in unbroken lines. And now that they were here, standing in this space, they could all feel it. The presence, the sense of something vast and ancient and aware, watching them from inside the sealed construct. Dr. Oakes wrote about her growing certainty that the symbols weren't decorative. They were functional. Warnings, prohibitions, commands etched in stone by people who desperately needed future generations to understand. Stay away, leave this place undisturbed, never break the seal, never free what lies within. The symbols were in a language none of them recognized, a writing system that predated anything in the archaeological record. But somehow standing there, in that chamber with those words carved into stone all around them, the meaning was clear. This place was a prison, and whatever was imprisoned here was never meant to be freed. One of the researchers, Dr. Raymond Cole, became obsessed with the markings, while the others were setting up equipment, taking measurements, documenting the chamber. Raymond stood at the construct, running his hands over the symbols, tracing them with his fingers, his lips moving silently. Dr. Oakes wrote about her growing concern. Raymond's behavior was changing. His eyes had a distant quality, as if he was listening to something no one else could hear. When they called his name, he didn't respond immediately, seemed to need several seconds to come back to awareness of his surroundings. He stopped eating, claiming he wasn't hungry. He stopped sleeping, though he should have been exhausted from the descent. He just stood at the construct, touching it, communing with it, understanding flowing into him from sources he couldn't explain. The team spent 3 days in the chamber, working in shifts, ascending to the surface to rest and resupply, then returning to continue their research. But with each descent, Raymond became more detached, more focused on the construct, to the exclusion of everything else. He started speaking in phrases that made no sense, words that might have been attempts to reproduce the symbols they were seeing. He claimed he was beginning to understand the language, that it was speaking to him, teaching itself to him in his mind. The others tried to intervene, tried to bring him back to the surface for good, to get him medical attention. But he refused to leave. He became aggressive when they tried to force him, displayed strength that seemed impossible for his frame. 5 days before the station went silent, Dr. Oakes wrote an increasingly frantic script. Raymond claims he understands the language now. He says it's speaking to him directly, not through the symbols, but into his mind. He says it's been calling to us since we first drilled into the ice, that our instruments, picking up those tremors, was it reaching out, trying to make contact. He says it knows we've come to free it. He says it's been waiting so long, trapped in the dark, and it's grateful we've finally arrived. The others are frightened. Some want to leave immediately, to seal the fissure and forget we ever found this place. But Raymond won't come with us. He says his place is here now. He says he has a purpose to fulfill. The next entries were shorter, more disjointed, written by someone who was no longer sleeping, no longer eating, sustained by adrenaline and fear alone. The team tried to physically remove Raymond from the chamber, but he fought them with inhuman strength. He threw Marcus Day across the chamber hard enough to crack 2 ribs. He moved with speed that should have been impossible, anticipating their movements before they made them. Eventually they retreated to the surface, planning to call for help, for professionals who could handle this situation. But Raymond stayed below, and the tremors started again, stronger now, rhythmic and purposeful. 2 days before the station went silent, Dr. Oakes and Thomas Westbrook descended one more time, hoping to reason with Raymond, to convince him to come back before something terrible happened. They found him at the construct, his hands pressed against the symbols, his eyes closed, his entire body vibrating with the tremors that shook the chamber. The chains had begun to crack, not broken yet, but showing stress fractures, the ancient stone finally yielding to forces it had held back for millennia, and Raymond was smiling. Dr. Oakes wrote, he opened his eyes when we approached, and they weren't his eyes anymore. They were older, vaster, full of knowledge that no human should possess. He spoke, but it wasn't his voice. It was multiple voices layered over each other, speaking in perfect synchronization. He said, "The seal weakens, the chains fail. Soon I will walk again beneath open sky, and my brothers will follow. Thank you for freeing me. Thank you for opening the door." Then he placed his hands on the mechanism we hadn't even realized was there, hidden in plain sight among the symbols, and he activated it. The final entry was barely legible, the handwriting deteriorating into frantic scrawls that tore through the paper. The words ran together without punctuation, as if she'd been writing as fast as her hand could move, desperate to get it all down before something happened. Raymond found the mechanism. We tried to stop him, but he was so strong, impossibly strong, threw Thomas against the wall. He's not moving, not breathing. Raymond is laughing, but it's not his laugh. It's something else using his voice. The chains are breaking, can hear them snapping one by one. The seal is breaking, the lid is moving, can hear something inside, breathing after all these millennia. It's finally breathing again. The air tastes wrong, feels thick, can barely see. The symbols are glowing, now pulsing with light that hurts to look at directly. It remembers everything. It remembers the world before the flood, before humanity, before the sky and earth were separated. It remembers when it watched over the void, and what happened when it looked too long into that void, and the void looked back. God help us all. We've opened something that should have stayed closed forever, and I can hear it in my head now too, speaking my name, knowing everything I've ever thought or felt or feared, and it's telling me such beautiful, terrible things about what's coming, about what exists in the spaces between realities, about what it and its brothers were imprisoned to prevent, and why the imprisonment failed, and what happens next, and oh God, I understand. Now I understand what Raymond felt, why he couldn't look away, couldn't stop touching it, couldn't resist its call, because it's so much older than we are, so much vaster, and we're just children playing with forces we can't begin to comprehend. And it's free now, the construct is opening, and I can see. That was where the entry ended. Mid-sentence, mid-thought, the pen dragging across the page as if her hand had been pulled away suddenly. I stared at the final words, my heart pounding, my mouth dry. The journal's remaining pages were blank. Whatever Dr. Oakes had seen, whatever had happened in that moment, she never had the chance to write it down. I closed the journal carefully and looked up at my team. Luke had finished his research, his face illuminated by the blue glow of multiple computer screens. He'd pulled up everything he could find: academic papers, theological texts, ancient manuscripts that had been digitized and archived. "Azazel appears in the Book of Enoch," he said quietly, his voice tight. "One of the Watchers. According to the text, the Watchers were angels sent to observe humanity in its early days. They were supposed to watch without interfering, to report back to heaven on how God's creation was developing. But they didn't just watch. The Book of Enoch says they abandoned their posts, descended to earth, and took human wives. They taught humanity forbidden knowledge: warfare, cosmetics, agriculture, metalworking, astronomy. Things humans weren't supposed to know yet. Azazel specifically was said to have taught humans how to make weapons, how to wage war, how to create tools of destruction." Phil leaned against one of the lab benches, his expression skeptical but troubled. "So, we're chasing ancient mythology now? This is what we do? angels and demons and biblical apocalypse. But his voice lacked conviction. He'd seen the empty station, read the journal entries. Something had happened here. Something that defied easy explanation. Luke continued, pulling up an image of an ancient manuscript on one of the screens. The text says that God's judgment on the Watchers was severe. They were bound and imprisoned beneath mountains and desolate places to remain there until the final days of the world. The text specifically names several of the Watchers and describes their individual punishments. Azazel was cast into darkness, bound in the desert, buried beneath jagged rocks. He was to remain there until the day of judgment, when he would be cast into fire for his crimes. But that's mythology, I said, though even as I spoke the words, they felt hollow. Ancient stories written by people trying to make sense of things they didn't understand. Luke looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the same doubt I was feeling. Is it? We found a chamber 3 miles beneath the Arctic ice that shouldn't exist. A prison that predates human civilization. A team of scientists who opened something they shouldn't have and then vanished. Their last coherent thoughts were about something named Azazel, breaking free from imprisonment. At what point does mythology become operational reality? I didn't have an answer. Instead, I stood up, the journal still clutched in my hand. I need to contact headquarters. They need to know what we've found. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't enough. Headquarters would want evidence, proof, something more than the ramblings of a frightened scientist and ancient religious texts. They'd want us to investigate further, to gather concrete information. And despite every instinct screaming at me to leave, to get as far from this place as possible, I knew what I had to do. We need to see the chamber, I said. The words felt heavy, final, like I was pronouncing sentence on all of us. The others stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. Maybe the isolation and the disturbing circumstances were affecting my judgment. But we hadn't come all this way to turn back without understanding what had happened here. We needed to know what Dr. Oakes and her team had found, what they had unleashed. And somewhere deep down, below my rational scientist's mind, below my skeptical nature, I felt something pulling me towards that chamber. A certainty that whatever answers existed, they were down there in the dark, waiting. Luke protested immediately. Jacob, we should call for backup. Seal this whole place, let someone else handle this. We're not equipped for whatever this is. He was right, logically. We were an investigation team, not an expedition force. We had basic equipment, basic supplies. If something went wrong down there, we'd have no support, no backup, no way to get help quickly. Bubba spoke up, his voice calm but firm. Luke's got a point. We don't know what's down there. Don't know if it's stable, if it's safe, if whatever happened to the other team could happen to us. This is a bad idea. Phil said nothing, but his expression made his opinion clear. This was dangerous, possibly suicidal, definitely beyond the scope of our mission parameters, but I couldn't let it go. Something in Dr. Oakes' final entries had hooked into my brain and wouldn't release. The description of what Raymond had become, of what he'd said, of what was breaking free from that ancient prison. If there was even a chance it was real, if something had been released that posed a threat, we needed to know. We needed to understand what we were dealing with. I'm going down, I said, my voice steady, despite the fear churning in my gut. I need to see what they found. I need to understand what happened. If you want to stay here, maintain surface contact. That's fine, but I have to know. There was a long silence, then Bubba sighed and started checking his equipment. Well, I'm not letting you go down there alone. Someone needs to be there to patch you up when you do something stupid. I felt a rush of gratitude. Bubba had saved my life before, and I trusted him completely. If something went wrong, he was the one person I'd want beside me. Phil would stay topside, maintain communications, and monitor our descent. Luke would continue analysing the data they'd collected, looking for any additional information that might help us understand what we were walking into. We spent the next 2 hours preparing, gathering climbing gear, lighting equipment, recording devices. We loaded up on battery packs, knowing we'd need sustained light in the depths. We packed emergency supplies, first aid equipment, enough food and water for 24 hours in case we got trapped. We set up communication relays, placing repeaters along the route so we could maintain contact with the surface. Every moment felt like a countdown to something inevitable, like we were preparing for an execution rather than an expedition. The descent shaft was exactly where Dr. Oakes had described, a natural fissure in the rock, about 100 yards from the main facility. The entrance had been widened by the previous team, drilling equipment still in place around the opening. We could see where they'd set up their staging area, rope and harnesses and equipment caches. Everything looked normal, organised like they'd intended to return, but they never had. We activated our headlamps and began the descent, Bubba going first to test the anchor points, me following behind. The fissure swallowed us immediately, the circle of light from the surface shrinking above us until it was just a distant star. The walls pressed in from all sides, rough rock that scraped against our equipment and clothing. We descended in silence, the only sounds our breathing, the creak of rope under tension, and the occasional clatter of dislodged pebbles falling into darkness below. The temperature began to rise almost immediately, subtle at first, but growing more noticeable as we went deeper. My geological training said this was normal. Geothermal gradient meant that temperature increased with depth, but the rate of increase was wrong, faster than it should have been. By the time we'd descended a mile, I was sweating inside my thermal gear. By 2 miles, I'd stripped off my outer layers and was down to just a base layer and light jacket. The temperature had risen to something like 60 degrees. Comfortable room temperature, warm enough that I'd taken off my gloves and could feel the rock with my bare hands. It was smooth in places, almost polished, as if something had passed through here many times, wearing grooves into the stone. I tried not to think about what could have made those marks, what could have moved through solid rock with enough frequency to wear it smooth. We descended for hours, following the route the previous team had marked with reflective tape and LED markers. The fissure twisted and turned, sometimes opening into larger spaces where we could rest, sometimes narrowing until we had to squeeze through gaps that seemed impossibly tight. The rock around us groaned and settled, compressed by the enormous weight of the earth above. Every sound made me flinch, made me imagine the walls collapsing, the entire shaft sealing itself with us trapped inside. But the anchor points held. The route remained stable. We continued down into the darkness. At approximately 2.5 miles down, my headlamp started picking up something different. The walls had changed. They were no longer natural rock, but something carved, worked by intelligent hands. The surface was smooth, deliberately shaped, covered in the symbols Dr. Oakes had described. They ran in neat rows along both sides of the passage, as if marking the way, as if these last few 100 feet were meant to be a processional route. The symbols caught the light strangely, seeming to glow faintly with their own luminescence, though that might have been a trick of reflected lamplight and exhausted perception. Then the fissure opened up, and we dropped through the ceiling into the chamber. We'd set up a belay system so the descent was controlled, but my stomach still lurched as the walls fell away, and we dangled in open space. Bubba landed first, his feet touching solid ground with a soft thud that echoed in the vast space. I followed, releasing the rope and standing beside him. We raised our headlamps and looked around. The chamber was exactly as the probe footage had shown it, but being here in person was entirely different. The space was enormous, the ceiling lost in darkness above us, despite our powerful lights. The walls were covered in symbols, thousands upon thousands of them, carved with impossible precision into solid rock. They seemed to move in our lights, shifting and writhing, though I knew that had to be an optical illusion, created by the angle and shadow. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the symbols were alive, that they were watching us, judging us, warning us one final time to turn back before it was too late. At the centre stood the construct, the sarcophagus, but it wasn't sealed anymore. The lid had been cracked and pushed aside from within. The massive stone displaced by force so great it left gouges in the chamber floor. Ancient chains lay scattered on the ground, their links corroded by age but broken by something stronger than time should have been able to provide. The construct was open, empty. Whatever had been sealed inside for millennia was gone. Bubba's voice was tight when he spoke, barely above a whisper. "Boss, something's wrong. I can feel eyes on us." I felt it too, the sensation of being watched from every direction at once, of attention focused on us, from sources I couldn't identify. The chamber felt occupied even though we could see it was empty. The air had a quality I couldn't describe, thick and heavy, pressing against my skin like invisible hands. The temperature had dropped suddenly, dramatically, our breath beginning to mist in air that had been warm moments before. "Phil, do you copy?" I spoke into my radio, needing to hear another voice, needing confirmation that we weren't alone in the world. Static answered me for several long seconds. Then Phil's voice came through, distorted but recognizable. "Copy, Jacob. Your telemetry is all over the place. Atmospheric sensors are showing wild fluctuations. Temperature, pressure, even local gravity is reading wrong. Whatever's down there with you, it's affecting reality itself." That should have been my cue to leave, to get out immediately, to climb back up that shaft as fast as possible. But I was transfixed by the open construct, by the empty space where something ancient and terrible had been imprisoned. I walked towards it slowly, my footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. The interior of the construct was smooth, carved from a single piece of dark stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There were no restraints inside, no obvious mechanisms to keep something trapped. Just smooth stone and the symbols, carved on every internal surface in layers upon layers of text. And at the very bottom, scratched into the stone with something sharp, were words in English. "Recent scratches, made within the last few days," they said. "I understand now. It showed me. We are the door. We have always been the door. And the door is opening." It was Raymond Cole's handwriting. I recognized it from the documents we'd reviewed, from his personnel file. He'd been here, inside this construct, after it opened. He'd left this message, this final testament to what he'd learned, and then he'd left, or been taken, or been transformed into something else. I reached out to touch the words, and that's when the voice came. Not sound, not words spoken aloud, but thought pressed directly into my mind, forcing itself into my consciousness with such power that I couldn't resist it, couldn't block it out, couldn't do anything but receive what it wanted to give me. "How long has it been?" Time moved strangely in the dark. I tried to respond, tried to ask who was speaking, but my voice wouldn't work. My body had locked up, frozen in place by a will that wasn't my own. I could hear Bubba behind me, a strangled sound of terror as he experienced the same thing. We were held there, suspended, in that moment, while something vast and ancient turned its attention fully upon us. The presence grew stronger, more defined. Not physical form, there was nothing to see, nothing my eyes could focus on. But I could feel it, awareness that had existed for eons, intelligence that had witnessed the birth of stars and would outlast their deaths, memory that stretched back to when the world was formless and void. It surrounded us, permeated us, looked through us as if we were transparent, seeing not just our bodies, but our thoughts, our memories, our very souls laid bare. "I am Azazel," the voice said, and with the name came images, knowledge, understanding forced into my mind whether I wanted it or not. First of the Watchers to fall. I saw things then, visions more real than reality. I saw the world before creation took its current shape, before there was light and darkness, day and night, earth and sky. Just formless potential, infinite possibility, not yet collapsed into defined existence. And I saw beings of pure light, the first angels, given form and purpose by the creative force that would shape all reality. I saw their sacred duty. They were to watch over the boundaries of existence, to stand at the edges where reality met non-reality, where being bordered on unbeing. They were guardians, sentinels, eternal witnesses to the spaces between, and they were to keep what dwelled in those spaces from entering creation, because there were things in the void, things that existed outside the rules of reality, things that hungered for form, for substance, for entry into the world of defined existence. And I saw Azazel, magnificent and terrible, standing at his post at the edge of the void. I felt his duty, his pride in his purpose, his certainty that he was doing sacred work. But I also felt his curiosity grow, an itch that couldn't be scratched, a question that demanded answer. What were they protecting against? What existed beyond the veil? What was so dangerous that it required eternal vigilance? He needed to know. He needed to understand. So, he looked. The void looked back. And in that moment of contact, everything changed. Knowledge poured into him, truths about the nature of reality that no mind should contain. The void between existence and non-existence wasn't empty. It was full of things that existed in ways reality couldn't accommodate, things that thought thoughts that would shatter sanity, things that experienced time and space in dimensions that consciousness couldn't process. They were vast beyond measure, old beyond counting, and they were aware. They noticed Azazel's attention, and they responded. They showed him things, truths about creation, about the arbitrary nature of physical law, about how easily the structures of reality could be rewritten. They showed him what the world could be if different rules applied, if matter and energy behaved differently, if consciousness wasn't limited to biological substrates. They offered him knowledge, power, understanding beyond anything an angel was meant to possess. And in his pride, in his curiosity, in his arrogant certainty that he could control this power, he accepted. But you can't touch the void without being changed by it. You can't look into that infinite darkness without some of that darkness seeping into you. Azazel was infected, corrupted, transformed by knowledge that poisoned everything it touched. He couldn't stop thinking about what he'd learned, couldn't stop seeing reality the way the void had shown him, couldn't stop wanting to reshape creation according to those alien principles. And God's response wasn't punishment for disobedience. It was containment, quarantine. Azazel and the other Watchers who'd been exposed to the void were sealed away, imprisoned beneath the earth, locked in chambers carved from stone and wrapped in chains, inscribed with bindings that couldn't be broken from within. They weren't imprisoned for teaching humans forbidden arts, though that had come later, a side effect of their corruption. They were sealed away because they had been compromised, infected by something that exists outside creation itself. They were weapons aimed at reality's heart, loaded and primed, waiting only for someone foolish enough to open the door and pull the trigger. "I am not your destroyer." Azazel's voice filled my consciousness, and I felt something like pity in that ancient presence, like regret for what he'd become. "I am your warning." More images flooded my mind. More understanding forced into me, whether my sanity could handle it or not. I saw the research team in this chamber, saw Raymond Cole's hands on the symbols, saw understanding flooding through him as it had once flooded through Azazel millennia ago. Saw the seal breaking as Raymond, guided by Azazel's whispered instructions, activated mechanisms that the builders had hidden in plain sight. Saw the construct opening, the lid sliding aside, the chains snapping one by one, and I saw what emerged. Not Azazel's true form. He had no form anymore, just consciousness and will and corrupted knowledge. But I saw what he did to Raymond, how he poured himself into that human vessel, how he rewrote Raymond's mind and body to accommodate his presence. Saw Raymond's transformation into something that was no longer human, something that could survive Azazel's essence without being destroyed. And I saw the same thing happen to the rest of the team, one by one, as Azazel reached out and touched them, changed them, converted them into heralds of what was coming. "They walk your world now," Azazel said, and I saw them scattered across the globe. Dr. Oak's in a city, looking perfectly human to casual observation, but moving wrong when no one was watching, her eyes reflecting light like an animal's when caught at the right angle. Raymond Cole in another research station whispering to new scientists, drawing them toward new discoveries, guiding them to find other chambers, other prisons, other sealed watchers. The rest of the team spreading outward, infiltrating, preparing, laying groundwork for something vast and terrible. "Something stirs in the spaces between worlds," Azazel continued, and I felt the weight of what he was showing me, the scale of what was coming. It uses the Watchers as anchors, as doorways into physical reality. When you imprisoned us, you thought you were protecting creation, but you were only delaying the inevitable. We are the doors, and the doors are opening. More visions. I saw other chambers around the world, sealed prisons containing other Watchers. Antarctica, Siberia, the deep Amazon, the Australian outback, beneath the ocean floor, buried under deserts and mountains. Research stations investigating seismic anomalies, drilling projects that broke through to ancient voids, expeditions that found things they shouldn't have found. And I saw the seals breaking, one by one, in a carefully orchestrated sequence that had been planned before human civilization existed. The imprisoned Watchers were being freed. Each one emerged and immediately began converting humans, creating heralds, spreading the infection. They weren't working independently. They were coordinated, part of a vast intelligence that spanned the globe, that thought in time frames measured in epochs rather than years. The Book of Enoch names 200 Watchers cast down, Azazel said, and I heard something like satisfaction in his voice, like pride in a plan coming to fruition. Each one a potential gateway, each one a doorway that should remain closed. But your kind is curious, persistent. You dig and drill and explore. You find what should stay hidden. You open what should remain sealed, and with each opening, the threshold weakens. The boundary between your reality and the void grows thinner. When enough doorways open, when enough anchors are established, the things in the void will come through. Your reality will be rewritten to accommodate their existence. The visions, intensified, became more terrible. I saw cities transformed, their geometry wrong, buildings that existed in four-dimensional space that human eyes couldn't properly perceive. I saw people changed, their forms becoming fluid and uncertain, neither dead nor alive, but something that existed in the spaces between states. I saw the sky itself rupture like a membrane being pierced, revealing the void beyond, and things emerging from that void that made my mind scream in protest at their very existence. They were vast and ancient and utterly alien, beings that existed according to rules that contradicted physical law, that thought thoughts that would drive anyone who understood them to madness. "This is what I tried to prevent," Azazel said, and for a moment I felt his anguish, his regret for what his curiosity had cost. This is why I broke my watch, why I looked into the void. I sought to understand the enemy so I could fight it. Instead, I became its tool. I became the very thing I was meant to guard against. And now, after all these ages of imprisonment, I am free to serve my purpose. I am the first door to open, but I will not be the last. The presence showed me more, and I understood then what was truly happening. The Watchers weren't free agents acting on their own will. They were puppets, vessels, tools used by the things in the void to establish a foothold in reality. Each freed Watcher became an anchor point, a stable gateway through which the void could touch our world. The heralds they created, the converted humans, they were additional anchor points spreading the network, strengthening the connection. And when enough anchors existed, when the network reached a critical mass, the boundary between realities would collapse entirely. "You came seeking truth," Azazel said, and I felt something like pity in that ancient voice, like mercy being offered to someone who didn't deserve it. "So, I will give it to you. What exists beyond the veil has been waiting since before your world was formed. It is patient. It is vast. It has existed since before existence had meaning. And when enough doorways open, when enough anchors are established, when the threshold is finally crossed, it will come through. And your reality, your universe, your entire framework of physical law and causality and time, it will all be rewritten to accommodate what is coming. Humanity will not be destroyed. Destruction is too simple, too clean. You will be transformed, adapted, converted into something that can exist under new rules. You will continue, but you will not be you anymore. You will be something else, something that serves a purpose you cannot currently comprehend." The vision showed me what that meant. Humans transformed into living conduits for void energy. Their consciousness expanded into dimensions they weren't meant to perceive. Their bodies reshaped into geometries that allowed them to survive in rewritten reality. They weren't suffering. Suffering was a human concept that wouldn't apply anymore. But they weren't human either. They were tools, components, parts of a vast machine or organism or network that existed on a scale too large for individual consciousness to grasp. "This is the truth you sought," Azazel said. "This is what your scientists unleashed when they opened my prison. I was the first, but the others are waking. The network grows, the anchors multiply, and soon, very soon, the threshold will be crossed. The void will enter your reality, and reality will be forced to accommodate it. There is no stopping this. There is no seal strong enough, no prison secure enough, no force in your universe powerful enough to reverse what has been set in motion. The ending is already written. You are simply waiting to experience it." The presence withdrew slightly, and I could move again. I gasped, drawing breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, my heart pounding like it would burst from my chest. Beside me, Bubba collapsed to his knees, his hands pressed to his head, tears streaming down his face. He was making sounds, wordless moans of terror and anguish, his mind unable to process what it had just experienced. I grabbed him, hauled him to his feet with strength born of pure adrenaline and terror. "We're leaving now," I shouted, my voice echoing in the vast chamber. "We're getting out of here right now." We ran for the ascent point, scrambling over the broken chains and debris. Behind us, I could hear something. Not footsteps, not breathing, but something else. A sound like reality itself was being rewritten, like the fundamental structure of space was being altered at the molecular level. The temperature continued to drop, frost forming on the walls around us, ice crystals appearing in the air itself. The symbols on the walls were glowing now, pulsing with light that hurt to look at directly, their warnings finally made visible, now that it was far too late to heed them. We reached the rope and started climbing faster than was safe, faster than was sane, hauling ourselves up with desperate energy. Below us, the chamber was changing. The darkness was becoming absolute, no longer just absence of light, but presence of something else, void stuff seeping into physical space. I could hear Azazel's voice one final time, not in my head now, but echoing up from the depths. Go then. Tell them what you saw. Tell them what is coming. Let them prepare if they think preparation is possible. It will make no difference. The doors are opening. The anchors are being established. And when the threshold is finally crossed, when the void enters your reality in full, there will be nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, nowhere that exists outside the reach of what is coming. We climbed for hours, our hands bloody from the rope, our muscles screaming from the exertion, our lungs burning from the effort. The communication relay stations we'd placed on the way down had stopped functioning, crushed or frozen, or simply unable to work in the presence of whatever was following us up from below. We climbed in silence, in darkness broken only by our failing headlamps, driven by pure terror and the human instinct to survive, even when survival might be worse than the alternative. When we finally reached the surface, Phil was waiting. He took one look at us and went white. My hair had turned completely white, stark silver where it had been brown that morning. Bubba's eyes were vacant, unfocused, like he was seeing something far away, something that wasn't there. We were covered in frost despite climbing through passages that should have been warm. Our equipment was frozen, ice crystals forming in intricate patterns that looked disturbingly like the symbols from the chamber walls. Get on the radio, I told Phil, my voice hoarse from screaming during the climb. Call for immediate extraction. Tell them we need emergency evacuation. Tell them we found something. Tell them it's worse than anyone imagined. But even as I said it, I knew it wouldn't matter. I knew that whatever was coming, helicopters and evacuation protocols, wouldn't save us. Nothing would save us. The doors were opening. The threshold was approaching, and humanity's time as the dominant form of consciousness on Earth was coming to an end. Luke called for immediate extraction. The helicopter came despite dangerous weather, the pilots breaking every safety protocol to get us out. They took one look at Bubba, at his vacant eyes and wordless terror, and they knew this wasn't a routine pickup. The flight back to the staging area was silent. I couldn't speak, couldn't find words to explain what I'd experienced. How do you explain that reality itself is under threat? How do you convey the scale of what's coming when you don't fully understand it yourself? By the time we reached headquarters, I'd been awake for 36 hours straight, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the void, saw things moving in spaces where nothing should exist, saw the vast intelligence that existed outside creation, preparing to enter and reshape everything to accommodate its presence. The debriefing lasted 72 hours. They put me in a room with recording equipment and told me to explain everything. I told them about the chamber, the construct, the entity that called itself Azazel, the revelation about the Watchers, and what they were truly imprisoned for. I told them about the vision I'd received, about the things in the void, about the doors opening one by one across the planet, about the threshold approaching. I showed them the journal, Dr. Oakes's descent into terror and understanding. I showed them the recordings from our equipment, though most of it had been corrupted by whatever we'd encountered in that chamber. I showed them the evidence we'd gathered, physical proof that something impossible had occurred. And they looked at me with pity and concern and disbelief. They didn't believe me. Or more accurately, they didn't want to believe me. Because if what I was saying was true, if an ancient entity had been released that could rewrite reality itself, if there were 200 such entities potentially being freed across the globe, if the fundamental structure of existence was under threat, then what could they possibly do about it? The official determination was a psychotic break triggered by environmental stress and isolation. The research team had perished in a structural collapse when they attempted to explore an unstable geological formation. The facility was a total loss, too damaged to recover or investigate further. Case closed, file sealed. Nothing to see here, move along. They retired me with full pension and strict non-disclosure agreements. Luke, Phil and Bubba were reassigned to different departments, separated from each other, ordered never to discuss the mission or what we'd found. Bubba never spoke again. Whatever he'd experienced in that chamber, whatever Azazel had shown him or done to him, it broke something fundamental in his mind. He's in a care facility now, receiving round-the-clock psychiatric treatment. He sits in his room all day, drawing the same symbol over and over on any surface he can reach. The symbol from the chamber, the one that means doorway, in a language that predates human speech. The staff have tried to stop him, have taken away his drawing materials, but he just uses his fingers, tracing the symbol in dust on windows, in condensation on mirrors, scratching it into the walls with his fingernails until they bleed. That was 4 years ago. I live alone now, in rural Montana, as far from civilization as I can get, while still having internet access and communication capabilities. Because I haven't stopped investigating. I can't stop. Luke and Phil haven't either. We stay in contact through encrypted channels, share information, track the patterns. And there are patterns. Once you know what to look for, once you understand what you're seeing, the evidence is everywhere. Disappearances in remote regions across 6 continents. Not 1 or 2 isolated incidents, but hundreds, thousands, following predictable patterns centered around ancient sites and geological anomalies. Witnesses describing people who move strangely, whose eyes reflect light wrong, whose shadows fall in directions that don't match the sun, whose voices have a quality that makes your teeth ache and your vision blur. Ancient archaeological sites showing increased seismic activity following the same 17-minute patterns we detected in Canada. Research and nature expeditions going silent in Antarctica, Siberia, the deep Amazon, the Australian outback, beneath the ocean floor in submersibles that stop responding mid-dive. Phil has interviewed 17 survivors from different sites. 3 from a drilling operation in Siberia that broke through to a chamber identical to the one we found. 5 from an archaeological expedition in Antarctica that uncovered a sealed vault beneath 2 miles of ice. 4 from a deep sea exploration that mapped an impossible structure on the ocean floor. 2 from a cave system in South America that contained symbols matching those we'd seen. And 3 from locations they won't specify. 2 traumatized to provide details. They all tell versions of the same story. Something beneath the earth. Something waking up. Something that remembers when the world was different and has plans to make it different again. Luke has compiled satellite imagery and seismic data from across the globe. He's identified 73 locations showing the characteristic signatures we learned to recognize. Unusual seismic patterns, thermal anomalies, gravitational fluctuations, electromagnetic disturbances, all centered on remote locations, all following the same progression. Initial tremors, followed by investigation, followed by silence, and the locations are spreading, accelerating. In 2019, there were 14 known sites. By 2020, 32. In 2021, 57. Now, in 2023, 73 confirmed, and probably dozens more we haven't detected yet. The pattern is clear. The seals are breaking systematically in a sequence that suggests coordination and intelligence. Each freed watcher immediately begins converting humans, creating heralds who spread outward and guide others to new sites. The network is growing exponentially, doubling approximately every 8 months. At the current rate, by 2025, we estimate there will be over 200 active sites, 200 freed watchers, 200 anchors for what exists in the void. The threshold Azazel described, the point at which the boundary between realities collapses, will be reached. Government agencies worldwide are quietly evacuating populations near ancient sites, relocating people without explanation, declaring areas off-limits for vague security reasons. They know something's happening. They're tracking the same patterns we are. They're preparing, but they're not telling anyone. They think they can contain it, manage it, control it through secrecy and careful crisis management. They're wrong. I've seen what's coming. I've felt its presence pressing against the boundaries of our reality. You can't contain something that exists outside the rules of existence. You can't manage something that predates management as a concept. I contacted Dr. Ruth Harrison again 6 months ago, told her everything, held nothing back, showed her the evidence Luke and Phil and I had compiled, the patterns we'd identified, the witnesses we'd interviewed. She spent a week reviewing it all, cross-referencing with ancient texts and apocryphal manuscripts. When she called me back, her voice was shaking. The Book of Enoch names 200 watchers cast down, she said. If Azazel has been freed, if the pattern you're describing is accurate, then yes, the others are awakening as well. And if what you experienced is true, if they're serving as doorways for something else, then we're facing something far worse than fallen angels. We're facing the reason those angels were supposed to stand guard in the first place. She sent me additional texts, translations of documents that weren't widely available, Dead Sea Scrolls fragments that described the Watcher's original purpose in more detail, Gnostic Gospels that spoke of the void and what dwelled there, Sumerian tablets that predated the Enoch tradition but described similar entities imprisoned beneath the earth. All of them shared common themes: guardians who failed, boundaries that were breached, knowledge that corrupted, and warnings about what would happen when the imprisoned were finally freed. 200 doors, 200 anchors for what exists beyond the veil, 200 entry points for something that should never enter our reality, and they're opening, one by one, in carefully planned sequence. I can track it happening. Luke sends me reports weekly, detailed analyses of new sites, new disappearances, new heralds spreading across the globe. Phil documents the evacuations, the quiet government operations to relocate populations, the increasing militarization of remote sites. The response is inadequate, reactive, based on false assumptions about what they're facing. They think it's a containable threat, something that can be quarantined and studied and eventually neutralized. They're sending soldiers and scientists to investigate, to secure, to understand. And those soldiers and scientists are being converted, transformed into heralds, becoming part of the network they were sent to combat. The response is feeding the problem, accelerating the very process it's meant to stop. Every investigation is another opportunity for contact, another chance for Azazel and his brothers to reach out and touch someone, to change them, to add them to the growing army of heralds, preparing the world for what's coming. Last week, Luke called me with something new. Jacob, I've been analysing the conversion process, trying to understand how it works. I've interviewed 3 people who claim they were touched by the heralds but managed to resist the transformation. Their stories are consistent. The heralds don't force compliance. They offer knowledge, understanding, enlightenment. They show people the truth about reality, about how limited our perception is, about how much more exists beyond what we can see and touch. And most people accept it. They want that knowledge. They want to understand. They willingly open themselves to the transformation. That's the truly terrifying part. This isn't an invasion in the traditional sense. It's a conversion, a revelation. The heralds are offering people something they desperately want: truth and understanding and membership in something vast and eternal. And people are accepting, willingly becoming part of the network, voluntarily surrendering their humanity for the promise of transcendence. You can't fight that with soldiers and guns. You can't quarantine an idea. You can't kill something that people are choosing to become. Phil has tracking unusual activity in major cities now. People acting strangely, gathering in groups, speaking in languages no one recognizes. Not isolated incidents anymore, but organized movements. Coordinated activities happening simultaneously across multiple continents. The network is moving into populated areas, no longer limited to remote sites and research stations. The heralds are recruiting openly now, not even trying to hide what they're doing, and people are joining them. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people, voluntarily becoming part of something they don't fully understand, because it offers answers to questions they've always had. Yesterday, Bubba's doctor sent me new drawings. He's still in the care facility, still non-verbal, still locked in whatever mental space Azazel left him in. But his drawings have changed. He's not just reproducing the doorway symbol anymore. He's drawing new symbols, ones none of us recognize, geometric figures that hurt to look at for too long. The doctors think it's his mind fragmenting further, creating increasingly abstract representations of his trauma. But I think it's something else. I think he's receiving instructions, blueprints, schematics for something that hasn't been built yet, but will be built soon. Because that's what the heralds are doing. They're not just recruiting and spreading and converting. They're building. Luke has satellite imagery showing construction at multiple sites. Not normal construction, not buildings or roads or infrastructure. Geometric structures that don't make sense, that seem to exist in more than 3 dimensions, that create optical effects that satellite cameras can't properly capture. They're creating physical anchors, stabilizing the gateways, preparing landing pads for what's coming through when the threshold is crossed. I'm telling this story now because staying quiet is worse than any consequence they can threaten me with. I've broken my non-disclosure agreement multiple times, sharing information with researchers and journalists and anyone who will listen. I'll face whatever legal action they throw at me. It doesn't matter anymore. Legal consequences are meaningless when reality itself is under threat. People deserve to know what's awakening beneath their feet, what's spreading through their cities, what's coming for them whether they believe it or not. The truth is, we're not alone. We've never been alone. We share our reality with things that predate us, things that exist in the spaces between existence and non-existence, things that hunger to enter our world and remake it in their image. For millennia, they've been kept at bay by seals and prisons and the sacrifice of angels who stood watch at the boundaries of creation. But those seals are breaking, those prisons are opening, and the watchers, corrupted and transformed, are no longer our guardians. They're doorways, and the things beyond those doorways are patient and vast and utterly inevitable. Azazel showed me the truth. He showed me what's coming, not to terrify me, though it did, but to give humanity one final chance. One chance to prepare, to understand, to maybe find a way to adapt to what's going to happen. Because he was clear about one thing: this cannot be stopped. The process is too far advanced, the network too established, the threshold too close. The best we can hope for is to be ready to face the transformation with open eyes rather than willful ignorance. My name is Jacob Wright. 4 years ago, I met something that called itself Azazel, the first angel to fall. It showed me the truth about our reality, about what exists in the spaces we can't see, about what's coming for all of us. And now I'm warning you the way Azazel warned me. The doors are opening, the anchors are being established, the threshold is approaching, and very soon the things in the void will enter our reality, and everything we think we know about existence will be rewritten. This isn't the end of my story. It's the beginning of something far worse, something that will affect every person on this planet, every living thing, every atom of matter, and every quantum of energy. The question isn't whether you believe my testimony. The question is, what will you do when you see it for yourself? Because you will see it. We all will. Very soon. The signs are accelerating. The heralds are spreading. The construction is nearly complete. And when the threshold is finally crossed, when enough doors have opened and enough anchors have been established, reality as we understand it will end. Not destroyed. Transformed. Rewritten according to principles that exist outside our current framework of physical law. Will you fight it? Will you accept it? Will you try to hide from it? None of those choices will matter. The void is coming, and it will reach everywhere, touch everything, remake all that exists. The only real choice is whether you face it with understanding or ignorance, whether you know what's happening to you as it happens, or whether you die confused and terrified, never understanding what unmade you. I chose understanding. Azazel gave me that gift, showed me the truth, even though it cost me my sanity and my peace. Now I'm passing that gift to you. The doors are opening, the void is entering, and the world you know is ending, replaced by something vaster and stranger and more terrible than human consciousness was meant to comprehend. May whatever gods still listen have mercy on us all, because the things coming through those doors have no concept of mercy, no understanding of compassion, no frame of reference for human suffering or hope or fear. They are simply too vast, too alien, too other to care about something as small and temporary as humanity. The ending is already written. We are simply waiting to experience it, and that experience is coming very, very soon.